A black aviation inspector boards his flight like any other passenger, just wanting a quiet trip. But then everything changes. A flight attendant tries to force him out of his first-class seat to make room for a white executive, even though half the cabin is empty. She doesn't know who he is. Just 7 minutes later, she learns the hard way. Because when he pulls out his federal aviation badge, what happens next sends shockwaves through the crew, the airline, and eventually, the entire industry. What started as a routine flight explodes into a national scandal about discrimination in the skies. And the quiet black man in seat 3A? He refuses to be moved, literally and symbolically. Stay with me. This is not just a story about a seat. It's about power, dignity, and what happens when one man decides he's not going to be silent anymore. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more truths that need to be told. It all started on an ordinary morning in Chicago. The aisle stretched ahead like a question no one wanted to answer. Malcolm Everhart stepped onto Flight 391 bound for Atlanta, not as a tourist, not as someone escaping, but as a man returning home through the sky he'd spent a lifetime helping to make safer. His suit was clean, but not new. His briefcase, worn, but orderly. He moved with the confidence of a man who had earned his seat 2C, first class, through years of miles and moments, too many nights in airport hotels, too many sacrifices no one ever tallied. He placed his bag beneath the seat, sat down and opened his tablet, scrolling through inspection reports. Tomorrow's assignment waited on the tarmac in Atlanta. Routine. But nothing in this country, nothing when you looked like him, was ever just routine. The cabin was still filling. The overhead compartments clicked open and shut like hesitant promises. Flight attendants smiled with the mechanical grace of professionals, and passengers floated past, some nodding politely, others ignoring him altogether. And then, there she was. Miss Candace Porter. Blonde. Crisp blue uniform. Eyes like winter's edge. "Excuse me, sir," she said, as if rehearsed. "There seems to be a seating issue." The words were soft, but the meaning behind them had teeth. Malcolm looked up, then down at his boarding pass. 2C, he said. "That's me." She smiled again. This time, it didn't even try to reach her eyes. "Yes, of course. But we have a platinum member who specifically requested the seat." Malcolm blinked. "There are 5 empty seats in this cabin. All windows. All first class." "Yes, sir. But this passenger prefers this seat. And we'd like to offer you one in economy, just as comfortable. We'll be happy to compensate you for the inconvenience." The man behind her stood silently, scrolling his phone like this was all beneath him. White. Rich. The type who expected comfort to rearrange itself around him. Malcolm smiled, but only with his mouth. "I've flown over 2 million miles in my life. And I've never been offered economy as a reward." Candace's smile wavered. The man didn't even look at him. And somewhere between the ceiling fan hum and the low conversations of the cabin, a pattern revealed itself. Not loud, not violent, just familiar. This wasn't about preference. It was about presence. About who was allowed to be seen in certain places and who was expected to quietly disappear when their existence made someone else uncomfortable. Malcolm folded his hands and said, "I think I'll stay where I am." The tension didn't break. It hung like smoke after a shot fired in silence. And that was just the beginning. The air in the cabin thickened, not with heat, but with expectation. Candace did not retreat. Instead, she adjusted her blouse and smiled tighter. That kind of smile you've seen before, the one white folks wear when they think they're being patient with you. When they still believe, deep down, that what they're asking is reasonable, so long as you don't remind them of your dignity. "Sir," she said again, "we'd really appreciate your cooperation." Malcolm felt the stars now. From the aisle, from across the row, a few passengers, businessmen in polished shoes, a mother with a tired child, had paused in their pre-flight rituals. They weren't looking for trouble, but they knew when trouble was nearby. And somehow it always began when a black man said no. "I've already cooperated," Malcolm said, still seated. "I bought this ticket. I checked in. I sat down." The cooperation was paid for in full. Candace's eyes hardened, but her voice stayed sweet. "It's just that this seat was expected by one of our frequent flyers. He's quite particular." Behind her, the man, Mr. Terence Locke, as Malcolm would later learn, shifted impatiently, not looking at either of them. He adjusted the cuff of his French shirt like the seat was his inheritance and Malcolm was the intruder who forgot the rules of the house. And that's the thing. They expect you to know. Not because it's written down, but because it's written in the air, in the tilt of a chin, the second glance, the narrowed stare when you're too well-dressed for the assumptions assigned to your skin. "You could move," Candace said softly now, leaning in. "We'd make sure you were compensated. I can offer you a drink voucher." A drink voucher. As if his dignity could be bartered for gin in a plastic cup. Malcolm looked around. First class wasn't full. There were 5 other empty window seats. None of them mattered because the problem wasn't availability, it was visibility. This wasn't about a man needing a seat. It was about a man needing that black face removed from where it didn't belong. He thought of his father, who had once been removed from a bus in Birmingham for sitting too close to the front. The driver had offered no explanation. The police had offered no apology. "You may have expected me to comply," Malcolm said finally, voice like still water over sharp stone. "But I expected to be treated like any other passenger in this section." And there it was. The first real moment of tension. Not shouting. Not threats. Just the refusal to be made small. Candace straightened. Her authority was unraveling. And she didn't like it. "I'm the cabin manager," she said, her voice louder now so that the others could hear. "You're refusing to comply with crew instructions. That's a violation of FAA regulation." The line had been drawn. Now she would use the system. Because that's what power does when politeness fails. There's a moment, right before a lie becomes law, when the room holds its breath. Candace Porter had reached that edge. Her voice had risen. Her tone sharpened. The performance of protocol was now in full swing. She was quoting regulations to the very man whose lived experience had shaped those very policies. That was the danger of assuming the role of power without knowing the ground beneath it. "Sir, if you don't comply," she said, glancing toward the cockpit, "we'll be forced to notify the captain." Malcolm looked up, not with anger, not even defiance, but something far more devastating in a society that thrives on assumption. Clarity. He reached into his inner jacket pocket. No sudden moves. No dramatics. Just the deliberate, quiet motion of a man who'd been through this more times than he cared to count. From the leather sleeve, he withdrew a card. Clean. Federal. He held it up, not like a weapon, but like a mirror. "My name is Malcolm Everhart," he said, voice still even. "Senior Safety and Compliance Inspector. Federal Aviation Administration." The hush was immediate. You could feel the floor of that plane tilt, if only in spirit. Candace frozen. The name, the title, the emblem not of apology but of accountability, shone just long enough for everyone within earshot to understand that the story had changed. "I am intimately familiar with the regulations you're referencing," Malcolm continued. "And none of them support removing a seated, ticketed passenger without cause, unless cause is defined as discomfort with my skin." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She looked behind her for backup that wasn't coming. Sofia Rivera, the other attendant, the one who had quietly observed, took a step forward. She didn't speak, but her body spoke for her. She stood not behind Candace, but beside Malcolm. Slight. Steady. It was a line drawn without fanfare. Terence Locke, the man who had demanded the seat, suddenly found the back of his phone intensely interesting. His entitlement collapsed into irrelevance the moment his preference met authority. He said nothing. He never had to. That's how this thing works, until it doesn't. Candace looked down. Hi, I apologize, Inspector Everhart. I didn't realize. You didn't care to realize, Malcolm said. Because you didn't have to. That's the privilege. No one cheered. There was no applause. Just that moment, raw, undeniable, when the story turned. And the real problem wasn't the mistake. It was that the mistake was expected. When Malcolm returned his credentials to his pocket, the world inside that aircraft didn't breathe easier, it just breathed differently. The air was no longer charged, just heavy. Candace retreated to the galley. Mr. Locke found himself quietly escorted to seat 4A by Sophia, who managed, with a single glance, to say more than her supervisor had with 100 words. Malcolm remained in his seat, hands folded, staring out the small window at a tarmac that now felt more honest than most men. The passengers had all resumed their pre-flight rituals. Magazines reopened. Earbuds inserted. Necks bent. But the truth has unfolded in public, and that kind of truth doesn't disappear. It stains. That's when she sat beside him. She moved like someone with purpose, but without pomp. Dark hair. Wire-rimmed glasses. A face marked by thought. Not curiosity, but recognition. Dr. Corinne Ayres, she said, as if stating the weather. Neurologist. But more importantly, witness. Malcolm turned. Raised an eyebrow. Witness to what? To the theater of your dignity, she replied, pulling out a small book and slipping a bookmark in its spine. Handled with grace under fire. He almost laughed, but didn't. That wasn't fire. That was friction. Fire is when they call the marshals. And yet, she said, it was still a test. One you weren't supposed to pass. Malcolm nodded slowly. They never expect you to pass. They expect you to leave. There was silence, not awkward, but charged. I've flown enough, she continued, to know what I saw wasn't just an isolated moment. It was a repetition. A loop. The kind that only certain people live through. Malcolm didn't answer at first. He stared ahead, at the aisle, at the passengers who had not spoken, who had not interfered, who had not even looked. You know, he said slowly, I used to think the worst part was the confrontation itself. But it's not. What is it then? She asked. It's the silence from the ones who knew better and said nothing. He gestured faintly. The man across the aisle who looked away. The woman in 2A who stared down into her purse like it held the gospel. They saw. But seeing isn't the same as witnessing. Seeing says, it's not my problem. Witnessing says, it shouldn't be yours alone. Dr. Ayres nodded. My father said the same thing. Grew up in Baltimore. Desegregated his high school. Said the worst violence wasn't from the ones who hated him, it was from the ones who claimed to love justice, but refused to speak when it cost them something. Malcolm exhaled, not bitterly, but with the weight of recognition. People forget silence has fingerprints. A pause. And people over 60, he added, voice softer now, people who remember the counters, the hoses, the marches, they don't have the luxury of pretending this is new. She looked him full in the face. No, we don't. The captain's voice crackled through the cabin then, welcoming passengers, announcing their on-time departure to Atlanta. Outside the window, the sky remained unchanged. But inside, something had shifted. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stay seated. The plane cut through the sky like a prayer it didn't believe in. Somewhere over Kentucky, the seatbelt sign dinged off and the drink carts began their quiet roll down the aisle. Ice clinked. Napkins folded like apologies. And just when the moment began to settle, just when the passengers thought they could forget the awkward theater they'd witnessed, a soft voice returned to Malcolm's side. Inspector Everhart, said Sophia Rivera, leaning in slightly, her tone respectful, but deliberate. The captain would like a word with you. When you're ready. Malcolm glanced at her, then at Corinne Ayres, who gave him a nod, not approval, but understanding. He stood, straightened his jacket, and followed Sophia through the front of the cabin. Candace stood stiffly in the galley, pretending to rearrange water bottles. She didn't look up. Inside the cockpit, the door closed with a hiss of finality. Captain Harold Kim sat straight-backed, hands folded, his co-pilot discreetly occupied with a clipboard. "Mr. Everhart," he said. "I appreciate you taking a moment." Malcolm nodded. "Captain, I've been informed of what happened before takeoff," Kim began, his voice low, almost rehearsed. "I want to offer my personal apology. That situation, it should not have unfolded the way it did." Malcolm studied him. A man who'd flown long enough to know the sky's indifference and the ground's cruelty. "Captain," Malcolm said calmly, "what exactly are you apologizing for?" The question hung there, heavier than the plane itself. Kim exhaled. "I'm apologizing for how my crew handled your presence. You were targeted." "I know that." Malcolm said nothing, because knowing wasn't the problem. Knowing but doing nothing, that was the marrow of it. "You should know," Kim continued, "Jessica, Miss Porter, has never had a formal complaint against her. She's respected. Solid record. But this was out of character." "No, Captain," Malcolm replied slowly. "This was entirely in character. Just not the one you want to believe she plays." Kim stiffened. "Let me ask you something," Malcolm continued. "If I hadn't shown my badge, if I'd just been another black man in a good suit, would she have faced any consequence? Or would you be apologizing to him right now?" Captain Kim's mouth opened slightly, but no answer came. "And here's the harder truth," Malcolm said, quieter now, like a confession. "This plane would have taken off with me in the back or not on board at all. She'd still be pouring coffee. Mr. Locke would be in my seat. And every passenger would tell the story as a misunderstanding." Silence. Not from lack of words, but from the weight of hearing something that couldn't be unseen. Kim finally said, "I'd like to handle this internally, without it becoming official. I'd ask, as a courtesy, that we speak further before you file anything." Malcolm leaned back slightly. "You want to manage it," he said, not unkindly. "You want to contain it. Because that's what the system's built for. Not justice, but containment." Kim swallowed. "She made a mistake." "No," Malcolm replied. "The mistake was thinking there'd be no consequence." He stood. "One more thing," Malcolm said at the door. "It's not just about her. Or me. It's about the fact that everyone saw, and no one stopped it." Captain Kim didn't respond. He couldn't. Some truths don't demand agreement. They simply stand in the room and refuse to leave. When Malcolm stepped back into the cabin, it wasn't the same plane he'd boarded. Everything had been scrubbed into order. Candace was all politeness again, offering service like it was salvation. Mr. Locke sat rigidly in 4A, eyes forward, as though ignoring history might erase it. But the tension wasn't gone. It had simply gone quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after lightning, when even the air is stunned. Dr. Ayres looked up from her book. "Does he say anything useful?" "He said everything but the truth," Malcolm murmured. "And even that came dressed in regret instead of responsibility." Sophia approached next, still carrying her tray, still playing her role, but her voice dropped to a near whisper as she leaned toward Malcolm. "For what it's worth," she said, "we talk about this. Among the crew. We see it happen more than you think." Malcolm glanced at her. Her posture was perfect, her tones still rehearsed, but her eyes held something raw. "You see it," he replied. "But do you name it?" Sophia hesitated. Then, not out loud. "Not if we want to keep flying." There it was. The trade-off. Dignity for altitude. "You shouldn't have had to flash your credentials just to be treated like a person," she added. "I didn't flash them for respect," Malcolm said. "I flashed them for proof. Because too many people only believe black folks when we're holding a badge, or a Bible, or a bullet wound." Sophia bit her lip. "Some of us want to say more. But we're tired. And some of us," Malcolm said, "have been tired for generations." She nodded. Then, with careful hands, she slipped a folded napkin onto his tray, as if passing a secret. On it, written in faint blue ink, was a number and 3 words. call if needed. He didn't smile. Not because he wasn't moved, but because he knew what it cost her to give that. Truth always has a price. The rest of the flight passed like a held breath. No more requests. No more apologies. Only that strange, shared knowledge that something had broken, and everyone was pretending it hadn't. Malcolm didn't speak again until the plane began its descent. "Do you know what scares people more than confrontation?" he asked quietly, to no one in particular. Dr. Ayres looked up. "What?" "Reckoning. The moment when the thing they've denied for years stands up and says, 'I kept the receipts.'" The wheels touched down in Atlanta. But what had landed wasn't just a plane. It was a question, still unanswered, still unresolved, circling like smoke in the lungs of a country too proud to cough. Atlanta met the wheels with a jolt, nothing violent, but enough to remind you that arrival is rarely smooth. Malcolm sat still as passengers stood. The usual shuffle began, bags lifted, eyes averted, voices lowered. People wanted distance from the moment. From him. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what he revealed. You see, in America, the greatest sin is not being wrong. It's proving someone else was. As he moved up the aisle, Sophia caught his eye. Just a nod this time, but it held more weight than protocol ever could. Candace, on the other hand, had mastered the art of absence, present in body, but nowhere to be found. At the gate, a man waited. Dark gray suit. Polished shoes. The kind of posture that came from power, but not earned power. Inherited. Assigned. "Mr. Everhart," he said, extending a hand. "James Lott, Director of Flight Operations. May I speak with you privately?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "That depends. Is this a conversation or containment?" Lott blinked. "I'd like to clear up any misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," Malcolm said. There was clarity. It just wasn't convenient. Still, he followed. Down the corridor. Into a private conference room that smelled of recycled carpet and corporate nerves. Lott gestured to a seat. Malcolm remained standing. "I've reviewed the incident," Lott began. "And while we regret the discomfort," Malcolm cut in. "Don't say discomfort. That's a word you use for turbulence. This was a decision. One made, not in error, but in habit." Lott hesitated. "We're prepared to offer compensation, flight credits, lounge access." Malcolm laughed. Low. Deep. Tired. "Let me ask you something," he said. "How many times have passengers like me been moved, questioned, delayed, not because of policy, but because of perception?" Lott didn't answer. "That's what makes this dangerous," Malcolm continued. "Not that it happened, but that it's routine. A script you pretend is improvisation." Lott's tone shifted. Defensive now. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. And a 100% tolerance for looking the other way," Malcolm replied. "That's the math, Director. And it adds up every time." He stepped toward the door, then paused. "You want this to go away," Malcolm said. "But I've spent my whole life being told to go away. And today I stayed. That's the part you weren't ready for." He opened the door, but before he left, he added, "You don't fix a broken system by offering a coupon. You fix it when somebody inside decides to stop being silent." And with that, Malcolm walked out. Not as a passenger, but as a reckoning. By the time Malcolm stepped outside the terminal, Atlanta's air was thick with more than humidity. It carried the heat of something beginning to unravel. His phone buzzer. A news alert. Federal aviation official confronted in racial profiling incident. Internal review underway. The story had cracked the surface. Not fully broken through. Not yet. But the veneer had thinned, and what lay beneath was beginning to pulse in the light. He stood beneath the arrival sign, a leather bag slung over his shoulder, watching planes rise into the sky. Each one carrying a myth. That flight was neutral, that skies were colorblind, that merit earned you a seat. But the sky, Malcolm knew, remembers everything. It remembers who gets asked to move. It remembers who is called sir and who is called this gentleman. It remembers the little girls with beads in their hair who get pulled aside. The mothers told them their stroller wouldn't fit. The fathers whose suits aren't enough. The tired eyes. The clipped tones. The thin smiles. The apology with the asterisk. The systems that wear uniforms and the ones that wear a smile. Because the thing about racism, about the kind of racism that older folks know too well, is that it's not just the insult or the violence. It's the way it makes you question your right to be still, to be silent, to be whole. And it's that same doubt that America tries to sell back to you every time you speak. Are you sure it happened that way? Maybe it was just a misunderstanding? He didn't mean anything by it. But Malcolm had stopped buying. The truth is, the most dangerous thing a black man can do in America is stay where he belongs. Without permission. Without apology. And today, he had done just that. Later that week, the airline would issue a formal statement. Jessica Porter would quietly resign. Mr. Locke would continue flying, now with the smug armor of silence. But somewhere, quietly, 1,000 other passengers would read the story and think twice. And a few would stand. Because the moment you realize you're not alone, that the pattern has a name, that it's not just you, that's the moment everything begins to change. Not quickly, not cleanly, but permanently. Malcolm walked to his waiting car, slid into the back seat, and exhaled. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of being seen. And for the first time in a long time, the sky above him didn't feel indifferent. It felt like it was listening.